So I was never a particularly good student. Like I was an okay student through it all, but I like to think that I was a consistent student, like C for consistency kind of student. My report card through most of my life, the teachers kind of had the general gist of Jared, which was Jared is capable and competent, but he is lazy. That was on more of my report cards than I probably should admit, standing up in public, especially with a live stream. All that's to say, I was never really in risk of failing any classes. Like I always did fine. I put in sort of the work I needed to get to that consistently C average, and all of that was true until I got into seminary. And there were actually some areas where I did really well in seminary, but the one time I actually thought I was in danger of failing a class was in the pastoral care and counseling class in seminary. And the professor called me and a friend into seminary, into his office and said, "Look, you guys are not getting the assignment." And what we did in these classes was we'd go through some of the theory of how to actively listen and how to do what sort of makes pastoral care happen. And then every week we would break up and we'd draw names out of a hat and we'd partner up with somebody who was in our class, a peer and a colleague, and we'd sit down and we'd pretend that we were in a pastoral intervention. And they'd have to make up something or share something from their life, and we would have to respond pastorally. And it was so weird. It was like so I went through seminary thinking, I absolutely hate pastoral care. I thought to myself, this is not me. This is not, maybe this whole ministry thing is not cut out for me. And so I went into my first pastoral charge, and for some reason, they still called me, even though I told them in the interview, I said, "Look, I've learned in seminary that I am not good at pastoral care." And so this little tiny church in the middle of nowhere, Saskatchewan, where pastoral care is literally the entire reason you have a pastor, called me and said, "Okay, if you're not good at pastoral care, that's okay. You can figure this out." And then I got into pastoral ministry, and I realized that there's a big difference between sitting in a classroom environment with peers and with colleagues and with people who are in the same situation of life as you, and being present when the hard stuff is actually happening, and being present for people when their life is on the rocks, and being present for people when they don't know how to get through one more day. And I learned that I actually like pastoral care, and that I'm actually pretty good at it. And more than that, I learned that pastoral care is actually such a vital part of why we do church the way we do church, because when you're there for somebody, you know that somebody's going to be there for you when you need it in return. That you build these relationships and you build this community and you build the strength of a faith family that lives and does the mess of life together in all the good ways. And all that's to say that I went into pastoral care thinking that I understood what it was about. And then I found its purpose. And the nature of pastoral care for me changed. Everything changes when you understand the purpose behind it. Routine becomes celebration. Everyday, mundane becomes extraordinary and extravagant. When you understand the purpose of something, when you understand why you're doing something or why you're doing what you're doing, doesn't it change for you? Doesn't it feel like not just something that you're getting through, but that you're something you're actually actively enjoying? Purpose is this powerful force in our world. I mean, we've seen it in the church through the 90s and the early 2000s. Everything was purpose-driven, wasn't it? We talked about the purpose-driven church, the purpose-driven ministry, the purpose-driven life, the purpose-driven youth ministry, the purpose-driven music ministry, the purpose-driven. We let purpose drive us. And every part of our life took hold of that sense of purpose, and we tried to let it guide us. And now, even in secular mission or in secular enterprise, we find the discussion of purpose and values are so integral to understanding who we are as a people in a community, whatever shape that community takes. Purpose is a powerful force in our world, and yet the world struggles to understand where purpose comes from. See, the thing about the world is that it's always going to be temporary. We know that fundamentally at a level that we wake up one day and we feel a little more creaky than we did the day before. We wake up one day and we have a little more gray in our hair than we did the day before. Our joints are a little more achy. Our movement is a little slower. This progress that we have, that we contend with every single day, is that we are moving from a point of vitality through a stage of entropy, through a stage of decay, into a state of let's say chemical equilibrium. That's the reality that we live in, and we all know that. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. If you woke up today and feel better than you did yesterday, then congratulations on being Benjamin Button, and let me know your secret. But the reality for 99.9999999% of human beings is that we are moving through a state of decay, and that we are moving through what the world is going through as well. That there is less of the world today than there was yesterday. Slightly less, but the world is moving from a state of vitality into a state of chemical equilibrium. And so if we look to the world for our sense of purpose, the reality is always going to be disappointing, because the world simply cannot give you what it does not have. The world cannot give you a sense of eternity and value if the world does not have a sense of eternity. The world, you can't pour from an empty cup. And so if we look to the world for our sense of purpose, the only thing we're ever going to get is needs that need to be met. And if you know anything about meeting needs, you know that the needs that need to be met are always going to outstrip the resources to meet those needs. And so if we find ourselves in a situation where we are looking to the world for our sense of purpose, then we are always going to be disappointed. And we are always going to come up short. Because the world cannot give you what the world does not have. And in order to find that purpose, the challenge that we have is to figure out, how do we start making investments in eternity so that we can reap the rewards? That's Jesus' message here in Matthew, is that if you focus on the things of the world, you're going to come up short, because those things are going to rust and decay and fall apart, just like me. But if you make your investments in something that is eternal itself, if you find value and if you find meaning and if you find purpose and hope in something that is never going to decay and is never going to fade away, is something that is not like me, then all of a sudden a sense of purpose can be found beyond just meeting needs that change day after day after day. How many of us have found it to be true that we live in this, when we find ourselves chasing needs and chasing things, we just wind up exhausted? The church offers us a better purpose. And the reality of it all is that it comes not from understanding that there is a deep or a transcendent reality that's somehow present in this world that can't be understood, but by recognizing that God's goodness gives people purpose. In the life of Jesus, we find the reality of God's sheer goodness stepping into reality and saying, if you find out that you can live a different way, and you still continue to live in a way that says you're going to decay, then why are you not choosing a better option? Jesus comes and steps into reality to remind us that God has a face, that God has a name, that God has an essential quality to himself that can't be denied and can't be shaken. And that God's essential characteristic is goodness. There is nothing you can say about God that is more true than that God is goodness. Because for hundreds of years, even before Jesus came, philosophers and theologians were discussing exactly that point. Like, do we talk about goodness because we understand God, or do we talk about God because we understand goodness? And 600 years after Plato wrote that question down, Jesus steps into the mix and says the answer is to both of those questions is yes. God exists in goodness as a fire exists in burning. It is just what happens. And so what Jesus is reminding us through this Sermon on the Mount, through the wisdom teaching that he offers, is that if we choose to invest in the things that Jesus invests in, we will reap the rewards here and now when it comes to purpose. That we can place our anchor in something eternal and find the strength to keep going when the storms of life batter us in the here and now. That what happens here and now does not have to fade away and rust and decay and fall apart. So he invites us to learn to cultivate habits of goodness. Learn how to build habits of goodness. And in the letter to the Galatians, Paul writes, the fruit of the Spirit. He's writing to this church in Galatia that's struggling with the question of how do we be a church together even though we're divided and we live in this polarized world. It's like imagine living in a world that was that polarized. Imagine living in a world where neighbors disagreed with each other on fundamental principles of what it means to be a human being. Imagine living in a world where you didn't know if you could really trust the people that you were working with. Imagine that. And Paul writes to them and says, with all of the division and all of the insecurity and all of the frustration that's going on around you, learn to find the fruit of the Spirit. Learn to prune the tree of the Spirit so that it produces fruit that is love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness and self-control and faithfulness and gentleness. And then he says, and against these things there is no law. No one, no matter how antagonistic they are to your faith, no matter how against the church they are, is going to say to a person who is being loving, joyful, peaceful, patient, kind, and good, and full of faith, self-controlled, and gentle, you need to stop doing those things. They're bad things. We recognize the goodness inherent in those things, not because they are somehow saving us, but because they are part of what it means to be a good person, that God's goodness gives people purpose. There's this neat evangelistic twist in this, because while we recognize that God's goodness gives people purpose, we also recognize that every single person, whether they understand who God is or what God has done for them, is already trying to do good things in the world around them. And so our job is not to say you need to be a good person in order to be a Christian, or you need to be a Christian in order to be a good person. It's to look at the good works that people are doing and connect them into the story of Jesus. To look at people's charity and say, this is good. This is what we're called to do. But if you think for a second that being generous and charitable is good enough to wipe clean your own shame, the hole that we feel, that the separation from God that we all feel that's built into us, if you think that that's enough, then you've missed something. And haven't you felt like you've missed something? Don't you feel like even when you give to charity that there's something more that you could do? Or you could simply ask the question, why is it good to do good? And no one, apart from understanding that the goodness of God gives people purpose, can answer that simple question. Why is it good to do good? So we build habits of goodness in our life together. In our practice, in our faithfulness, we learn how to build these habits of faithfulness, so that our habits can become a witness into our community that says that we're loving and we're joyful and we're peaceful and we're patient, because the world doesn't. It's not that the world is against these things, but the world will only ever pay lip service to them. The world isn't interested in people being loving. It wants people to be self-interested, because self-interested means consumption. It doesn't want people to be joyful. It wants people to be bitter, because bitter gets engagement. On and on. You can go through and we're actually going to spend some time in Galatians this fall. you can go through this list and you can find reasons for that the world says these are good things, and that yet the world doesn't produce them. The world doesn't invest in them. And so when we build habits of goodness, we are telling a story. We are pointing out a purpose in our world that comes from the goodness of God in one place or another, that recognizes that God's goodness gives people purpose. And when we step into that purpose and start building those habits, we find out that this gathering is somehow unique. Because the habits that we're building draw us into engagement with the world in a way that we could never do on our own, in a way that we could never fulfill on our terms. The theologian Frederick Buechner put it this way. He said, "The place God calls you to is where your deep joy meets the world's deep need." That's the place God calls you to. He's preparing you for a place where your skills, where your unique calling as a disciple of Jesus Christ, where your unique gifting as an apostle who has been called to go and serve the Lord in your particular context, is going to be uniquely positioned to affect the world in a way that only you can. And that your vocation, your calling, your plan, the plan God had for you from the beginning of creation, was to find your unique gift set and your unique place and join those together. And that is fundamentally why this gathering matters, because this is the only place where those three places connect, where eternity and people and the world join together. It would be like like one of those old milking stools, that farmers used to sit on when they were milking a cow. And I don't know, if you chop one of the legs of those off, how stable is that stool? Like, if you drop the question of eternity from a conversation between the world and people, you're just left with what the Canadian theologian Charles Taylor calls the malaise of modernity. You're left with this bland sense of nothingness that drives people into a state of depression and a state of utter anxiety, where we're left wondering if there is any meaning to any of this in the beginning. If you cut people out of the equation, you got nihilism, so that's not a starter. And if you cut people out of the equation, you're left with this vertical sense of piety that is so heavenly minded, it's no earthly good. And who does that save? It's like the faith picture that John Lennon offers us in Eleanor Rigby, right? Like, it's a funeral where no one is saved, where there's no good news proclaimed. Those are the three options. If you cut one of the leg off, if you stick with people and world, or people and God, or God and world, you end up with nothing that is workable. Except when you gather in the church is the one place where those three elements come together, where people, God, and world join together, and we find ourselves in the mission that God has for us. We find ourselves with purpose in this place. And so the reason that church matters, the ultimate reason that church matters, is because this is the only place that has the potential and the power to do what Jesus said it was going to do. That it was going to declare the church built on this rock, and that the gates of hell would not prevail against it. This matters because this is unique. This does not happen anywhere else. We are standing today, sitting today, being today in the presence of eternity, people, and the world. Why, church? Because the power, the goodness of God gives people purpose. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.